As you may know, Jack Kerouac was one of the prominent writers of the Beat generation. He wrote both poetry and novels, with his most famous of those being On the Road. I've found his 30 rules or pillars of writing, but I'm not going to go through all 30 because some of them are kind of weird, honestly. Instead, I'm going to run through all the ones I think are most valuable so that we can learn from them, whether we agree with Kerouac or we don't. I'll post the link to the full list in the description though, because they are worth reading. Alright, I'm going to move quick because there's a lot to cover, so here's the first tip. Number 1, scribbled secret notebooks and wild typewritten pages for your own joy. I've preserved his spelling and presentation for these tips, by the way. This one is one of the easier ones to interpret from this list. What I like about this in particular is the word secret. I think if you have a secret notebook full of ideas, a place where you keep your creativity before it becomes a story, then how could it not feel exciting when you eventually get moving with your project? I'm also a big believer in writing stuff down, digitally or on paper, as soon as you can after a new idea comes. I think there's something in doing that, pushing a little bit past the basic idea, that helps preserve the spark that brought it to you in the first place. In a sense, the more you scribble down about your idea, I think, the more substance it has and the less chance it has of fading away into nothingness, as often seems to happen, for me at least. Don't just write a conspiracy story when you're writing down those initial notes. Give it a little bit more than that. Who might that conspiracy involve? Where might it be set? Adding that little bit extra really helps the idea, I think, when you come back to it. By the way, if you're new here, I'm Kieran. I'm a writer and a freelance editor, and I love to help writers tell their stories while having fun doing it. So thanks for being here. Number 2, submissive to everything, open listening. Pretty fundamental advice for writers, really. Whatever kind of story you're writing right now, whether it's a geopolitical thriller or a sci-fi dystopia or a high fantasy epic, we're still, in some ways, writing about people and humanity and morality. There's no real way we can do that effectively if we're closed off to the world. The world is the beginning of every one of our stories and ideas, so staying open and receptive, as he mentions, I think is vital. And I don't just mean current events or history either. I mean what's going on around you generally. What might you pass in the street and what can you see from your window? This is great advice for writer's block too, I think. Not as a remedy necessarily, but as a prevention. Engage in things that pique your interest, even if it's unrelated to writing. Find and listen to other stories from our world that might just contain that spark that I mentioned before. One way I do this is to listen to podcasts from investigative journalists. There's just something in how they present those stories and how they uncover information that really fuels my creativity. This isn't sponsored in any way, but I'd check out Tortoise Media for that. They've got some really great examples. Number 3, be in love with your life. This one I can understand, even if I can't necessarily achieve it. I think he's talking about contentment and commitment to being a creative person here, or that's how I'm choosing to interpret it anyway. In the world in which we live, there are a million things that might pull at us or drag us away from being creative or writing that story that we've got bouncing around our head. And I'm sure if we were all blissfully in love with our lives, that creativity would be way easier to manage and to engage in. Nevertheless, I'm going to translate this into terms I can connect with more, which is to lead with positivity and optimism. And anyone who knows me in real life probably just laughed out loud at that. Admittedly, my outlook is not quite as shiny as that usually, but when it relates to writing, it really is. Make the effort, put in the time, step over that boundary of your own comfort, and I think that'll all come around. It'll turn into results for you if you do it for long enough. The thing is though, I think you also have to stop looking for those results in external terms. Book sales, awards, money, that kind of thing. To me, there's always a danger that that stuff can make art into products. And while that's not always a bad thing, it rarely gifts writers with long-lasting motivation and contentment, I think. Or you'd have to be very lucky if it did. My approach is to learn this craft and work at it so that I can be proud of how I maybe create stories that make people feel something during all of our very brief stints on this planet. That, I find, is a more longer-lasting source of motivation for me. I don't know if it counts as being in love with your life necessarily, but... Sorry, I'm interrupting my own video to tell you about my editing service. Whether you're working on short fiction or a full novel, I'd love to help you get the most out of it. I'll look at all the usual stuff like your spelling and grammar, but I'll also focus on how the story works, your dialogue, plot, pace and structure, everything, basically. I'll annotate your work with notes in the margin, and then at the end I'll write up all my thoughts, including your strengths, areas to develop, and what I recommend you focus on. It's all done over email, unless you want to hop on a video call to talk about something, so it can fit into any schedule, and all my feedback is friendly, positive, and most importantly, actionable. There's no need to take my word for all this though. There's tons of testimonials on my website from writers I've worked with if you want to know what they thought directly. Links in the description, or scan the QR code on the screen. Thanks for your patience. Back to the video. Number 4. Something that you feel will find its own form. This one speaks to me really clearly. I've recently started referring to myself as a by-feel kind of writer. I find it so much easier to navigate and build a story, especially a long story, using my instincts as a guide. Stuff like pace and the general direction of the plot and how long chapters should be, that all just feels like stuff I'd rather kind of eyeball. When I do that, stuff really does tend to find its form, as Kerouac puts it. I think because I know the ultimate heart of the story, I know what the central force or identity of it is. So from that, I have a rough trail to follow. I'm thinking about old cartoons where there's a pie or something giving off these steamy aroma lines. I'm the dog lifted up by its own nose and floating off in pursuit of the smell. That really is sort of how it works for me. That's just my approach. That's just the way I do it, and the way Kerouac did it as well, I think. I mean, if you've ever read The Road, you'll know that he certainly didn't apply any particular kind of structure to it. But if you do follow a framework and you build your story on that, that's great too. I'm all for anything that results in a story getting finished. Writing by feel is great for me, but it's far from the only way to do things. Structures exist for a reason, because they often work. I think it depends a bit on genre and all manner of other variables, but whatever the case, if you end up writing the end and you feel happy with what you've got, what more can you ask for? However your story finds its form, if it works for you, you're doing it right. Number 5, blow as deep as you want to blow. This one's a little broad, to put it mildly, so I've decided what I'm going to take from this, and that's the message of tell the story that you want to tell. A lot of new writers get hung up on advice from classic or established writers that might say something like, you better have something to say or don't bother, or, you need to want to change the world with your writing. I've said this before, and I think that the thought behind that approach is valid and well-intentioned, because, there are issues in the world that literature can help shine a light on, no doubt. But it's also alright to write cozy mysteries or cool sci-fi without directly meaning to make a bigger comment on the particular political climate of your country or the horrors of capitalism. That stuff's there, but not all writers need to incorporate that into their work. Writing to entertain is totally fine. The world needs that as well. Blow as deep as you want to blow. If you want to change the world, aim for that. If you want to entertain someone, aim for that instead. That's my take. It's all writing, and I think it all has value, one way or the other. Number 6. Write what you want bottomless, from bottom of the mind. Grammar aside, this one feels kind of similar to the last one for me, except maybe instead of being about telling the story that you want to tell, it could be about how you tell that story. I think you might be saying find whatever's compelling you to tell that story and write it from there, or like sing from the diaphragm. Guess you could put it like that, if you wanted. I'm reading this one as follow the force that originally compelled you to write your story and commit to that. Follow that reason and be led by it and stay close to it if you can. I think that purpose or that why can help you to stay on track. Listen to your subconscious, if that's even possible. The bottom of your mind, that's where the story probably began after all. If you keep checking in on that, especially in a longer project, it can help keep things consistent and on target, or it does for me anyway. Number 7, no time for poetry, but exactly what is. As an editor, it's all I can do not to highlight this and put a question mark in the margin. But I think this is advising against purple prose. Either that or he's saying don't dress up the facts of the story, or he's saying the substance of what the story is about is more important than nice writing. If it's any of those, then I generally agree. But I want to focus on the advice about purple prose because that can be a little bit misleading in some cases. For a brand new writer attempting their very first story, heading into it, aiming to be poetic and beautiful with your sentences can lead you down a path to creating a confusing mess of imagery. It's more important to be clear first ahead of anything else, I think. However, if you know your way around a story, if you've settled into your voice a little bit more perhaps, then don't mistake poetic language for purple prose. You can be poetic and still clear. You can be poetic and still tell a good story. In fact, you can do those things by being poetic. Some of that poetry is your voice and who you are, really, so don't cut that out of your story for fear of being dragged for purple prose. If you need to cut some of it back later, you can. As long as you can retain the clarity while you retain the poetry, that could work just fine. Having said that, Kerouac may not have meant any of that whatsoever. It's hard to say, so Kerouac scholars, if you're in the comments, let me know. Number 8, remove literary, grammatical and syntactical inhibition. Okay, this one's way easier to understand, and I think it's a valuable tip to bear in mind. Similar to what I said about purple prose, sanitizing or cleaning up our writing too much can sometimes make it feel a little bit characterless. Spelling and grammar and all that stuff is important for making sure our writing has clarity. That much is obvious. I think we should try not to make stuff actively difficult to read, unless that's a certain effect that we're going for. But beyond that, if you need to break the rules, or you think breaking the rules will add something to your story that following them wouldn't, do it. A few months ago, I wrote a story that's grammatically terrible, but it's a stream of consciousness story, heavy on character voice, so grammar and stuff didn't matter to me in that case. In fact, the lack of it added to the sense of who that character was, at least I think so, and I'm happy with how the story turned out. In fact, in a roundabout way, I think it's probably sparked a new novel idea for me. I wouldn't necessarily have found that if I'd been minding my P's and Q's the whole time. Number 9, telling the true story of the world in interior monologue. A few years ago, I made a video about how to create depth in your stories, and one of the things I talked about in that video, as far as I can remember anyway, was showing your world through the eyes of your character. Instead of describing things in general terms, like there was a flickering desk lamp on the table, you might say the flickering of a desk lamp was giving her a headache. This is a tiny, rough example, but what I think it does is help to frame the world through the interior experiences of your character. Helps readers see through their eyes a bit. Perhaps that's what Kerouac's getting at here, at least a little bit. Though that's just looking at it from a description and a kind of visual and immersion perspective, I suppose. He's probably more likely to be talking about the bigger picture, showing the reality of the world through the thoughts and feelings of one of the many people experiencing it. I think that fits in with some of the earlier tips about remaining open to the world and telling the story that you want to tell based on what you see and what you experience. Number 10. Don't think of words when you stop, but to see picture better. This one kind of reminds me of that episode of The Office when Kevin decides to start leaving out unnecessary words in his sentences. Why use many words when few words do trick? But beyond that, I think the message here is keep writing, even if you can't find the perfect word right now. Don't go spiraling off into the dictionary to try and find it. I can really see how that might knock you off your path or slow your momentum if you're in the middle of a scene and it's going well. And if that sounds like you and how you work, then there's value to that. In that case, write something that fits for now, and if you want to change it later, you've got the option. For me though, I like to think of myself as on the cleaner side of drafting. I generally like to write my first draft as though I'm writing my 10th, because I'm too lazy to write 10 drafts. I try to be as accurate as I can so I don't have to go back and change all that much. Maybe that means I'm a slower writer overall, but speed isn't necessarily an advantage with writing, unless you have deadlines, which I do not. Number 11, write for the world to read and see your exact pictures of it. One of the most straightforward tips here, no doubt about it, but I don't necessarily agree. There is a couple of ways to look at this, and I wish I had a penny for every time I've said that, but on one side, we're the storytellers. They're our stories that we're creating to make our points. In that way, I can understand wanting readers to see what we see exactly as we envision it, and I suppose that's the pinnacle of writing ability, the skills to reproduce something exactly in the reader's mind. Only the problem is, I think that's impossible. Every reader experiences the world in their own entirely separate way. Their culture, upbringing, profession, location, relationships, they're all entirely different from yours and mine, and all of that might affect how they read our stories. I mean, the thing is, a bunch of people can line up in front of a painting and all see something slightly different colours or different meanings or focuses, never mind first having to interpret language to create that image. So if giving a reader an exact picture is impossible, what's my better idea then? Well, I agree that we're telling our stories and making our points, but I just think we should allow or at least accept that readers will interpret them and imagine them in ways that are most appealing or accessible to them, and kind of let that go. My approach is to give enough detail that the minimalist readers, sort of like me, have enough detail to understand and follow along, and so that those with more detailed imaginations perhaps still have the option to fill in all of those gaps themselves and see exactly what they want to see. Allowing people to read your story in their own way, or as close to that as you can get, I think, is a key part of immersion and building a reader's connection to a story. Let them use their own discretion instead of imposing yourself as an author on them, and I think more people will sink into your stories further because they'll be reading it in their own language, essentially. That's probably quite a divisive tip, I think. So let's end on a thought from Kerouac that's universal and beyond any doubt. Number 12, you're a genius all the time. Before you go, see if you can find your favourite writer in this playlist of my famous author advice videos, and if you can't, let me know and I'll see if I can cover them too. Thank you so much for watching as always, and happy writing.